Hi, I'm Coach Corey Wayne, and this is my video series quotes, ruminations, and contemplations, where I take quotes from other people, famous people, successful people. They could be mindset quotes, they could be success quotes, they could have to do with relationships, achieving your dreams. And today's title is Perseverance, and this is a quote from Steve Jobs, and it says, or I should say, he said, "I'm convinced that about half of what separates successful entrepreneurs from the non-successful ones is pure perseverance." And I wrote about this in my second book, Mastering Yourself, where I talked about the things that would happen to Steve after he'd started Apple Company. He had brought in, I think his name was Steve Scully, who was at the time the CEO of Pepsi, and he got Steve to come on board and be the CEO of Apple. Well, over time, they eventually butted heads and had a falling out, and Steve Scully was actually able to run Steve out of his own company that he started, which was at the time Apple Computer, and I think they just call it Apple now. I think they need to change their corporate name. But an interesting story about that is that I think he had somewhere around $100 million, maybe 120, $140 million. And this is back in the early, mid 1980s. So he had this great success from what he and Steve Wozniak started in Steve's garage that eventually became one of the best technology companies in the world. I think now they've got a market cap of like over $1 trillion. They make really great products. And with Steve, what most people don't recognize is that success takes a long time. You got to think in terms of decades when it comes to accomplishing big goals. And so in the 1970s, they started Apple Computer in Steve's parents' garage. And when the company finally went public, and then he had the very public firing where he literally got booted out of his own company, obviously he was rich, but that took about 10 years. And people didn't really know who he was until his company had gone mainstream. And so you can imagine you have this great success, and then you get fired very publicly from the company that you founded. And he ended up buying part of, or it was Pixar, what became Pixar Pictures, from George Lucas, who is of the Star Wars fame. And what Steve saw was this animation software where George had and his team had invented it, because what they were doing is, back in the old days when you used to edit movie footage, you were literally cutting movie footage. You had explosions, you had the live action, you had models, you had all these different elements where you might have several clips of footage. And so he needed a quick way to edit these, and that led to the technology that eventually became part of Pixar Pictures. And the interesting thing in the story about perseverance is I think he's paid $4 or $5 million from Pixar from George Lucas, because at the time he had done, I think, that movie called Howard the Duck, and he spent a lot of money on it, and the movie just absolutely bombed, and he'd lost a lot of money on it. And so Steve coming in and buying Pixar, or what became Pixar, from George Lucas, helped George Lucas out. But just like when the original mouse came about, when he went, I think it was Xerox, if I'm not mistaken, who would actually come up with the mouse. And what was interesting is they invited him in, and he was sitting with some of their top engineers, and they were showing him this digital graphical interface. And then the executives that were in charge of the company didn't think it was anything useful at all. But Steve, he was great about was connecting dots and seeing what things could be. And when he saw what the mouse could do, he right away knew that that would be great for software. And so he set about the task of having his engineers at Apple come up with integrating the mouse and the graphical interface. And it's like the people at Xerox didn't know what they had. And one of the things he says, great artists steal. And so he had this company where the executives were too stupid and too set in their ways to have a vision of what it could be used for. And he came in, saw it, got exposed to it, And eventually that became part of Apple Computer. And so what's interesting is that he was able to connect dots and see how things could work together, and he could see opportunity. And he saw this in the software, the animation software that he had bought from George Lucas. But the problem was he didn't really know what he knew. The technology was amazing and he had ideas on what it could be used for, but he tried several different permutations of it, and he spent a large portion of the money that he had made from Apple on Pixar, but he still didn't have a successful business model and a way to market it to where people could see the value in it and they would actually buy and invest and use this particular product. And so you can imagine several years had gone by. He's 5 years, 6 years, 7 years in, and he's got most of his fortune has been invested in Pixar and also Next Computer, which was a computer company that he started after he left Apple. And the interesting thing about that was that his friends are like, dude, you got tens of millions of dollars in this thing, and it's just a money sink and it's not going anywhere. But he believed in himself and he believed in the technology and he believed in his team. And eventually they ended up doing a little animated short, showed it because he's like, who makes great animated movies and stories? Well, obviously Disney. And so he went to Disney and he showed this short animated film that they had made, and they were blown away by the technology. And so he did a joint venture with Disney, and they ended up working together and collaborating, and that movie became Toy Story. And so what was interesting is the movie came out and opened and just did phenomenal because the animation compared to any other animated movie was just, I mean, it just blew everything else away. So Toy Story was a huge box office hit. And then a few weeks later, they went public with Pixar and it became $1 billion company. And I think he sold it somewhere around $6 or $7 billion to Disney. And then he and his family became the largest private shareholders in Disney after the fact. But when you look at when he bought, I think it was 1983, 1984, when he actually bought the technology from George Lucas. And he didn't go public, and Toy Story didn't come out till 1995. So you're, 10, 12 years there of just pure perseverance and finding a way to come up with a successful business model. But he was basically losing his ass for 7, 8 years and investing tons of money, and it wasn't going anywhere. And so the other thing you look at is that Next Computer. He put a lot of money into that, and it really didn't take off. But then I think it was 1996, if I'm not mistaken, he ended up, Apple was basically about to go bankrupt because Steve Scully and the rest of the people that were running it basically ran Apple into the ground. And so the operating system that was Next Computer eventually became the software that we all know, love, and use on all Mac devices. And again, it's like he started this in the early mid 80s, and it wasn't until he came back to Apple in, I think it was 1996, that he was able to incorporate this, because Apple was literally 90 days away from going out of business. And he got everybody focused on the original mission of what Apple stood for, which was making really great technology products that make people's lives easier. So you got to remember, big goals take time. You got to think in terms of decades, not a few years or 5 years, because we tend to always overestimate what we can accomplish in a year, but we tend to underestimate what we can accomplish in a decade. And so I highly encourage you to go pick up Quotes, Ruminations, and Contemplations, my third book. It's got about 250 quotes from all kinds of different articles that I've written over the years on all kinds of topics of business, self-reliance, dating, relationships, human interaction. It's available in hardcover, paperback, digital format, audio book format at iTunes or audible.com. And if you'd like to book a coaching session with yours truly, go to understandingrelationships.com, click the products tab at the top of your screen, and book a coaching session. Until next time, we'll talk to you soon.